I was able to obtain some very unique footage of structure situations that I really feel is going to help to clearly define all of the concepts and the strategies that are needed for catching more and bigger bass. Unfortunately, the ideas concerning a bass or bass fishing and the methods that are being used today are the same now as they were back in Grandpa's time. In fact, probably the most accepted method is to sort of aimlessly drift or pull along some shoreline with your trolling motor, casting towards the bank and hoping that you might run into a fish. But after years of frustration and empty stringers, most fishermen have found out that those old antiquated methods of the past are no more effective today than they were back then. But the good news is there is a better way, and in this video today I've made an honest attempt to explain in detail all of the modern day strategies and the mechanical procedures that you need to know. But before we get out on the lake, there are a few facts that really must be understood, and these facts will sort of serve as an overall guide for us to catching bass in all types of water. First, we must accept the fact that deep water is the home of the bass. It'll be the deepest water in the lake, the deepest water available to a fish, or the deepest water in an area of a lake. But one thing is for sure, big bass, big fish, spend 90 to 95% of their entire adult life somewhere in deep water. In fact, most of the time these fish are so deep and they're so dormant that they're nearly impossible to catch. But as fishermen, we're saved due to the fact that they don't stay there all the time. Once or twice on a normal fishing day, these fish become active and will move from the deep water home areas towards the shallows. And we're saved again due to the fact that this movement is never in a haphazard fashion, but along well-defined routes or bottom features, which are referred to as structure. Now, at times, structure will be of a size or a shape or located in such a fashion that the fish will need some additional help to find their way. And this additional help comes in the form of what we refer to as breaks and break lines. Now, a break, by definition, is normally thought of as some object on the bottom of the lake, such as a rock pile, a stump, a stick-up, or a clump of weeds or something of this nature. And then a break line is where we have a line on structure that runs for a distance where we have a sudden increase in depth, sometimes referred to as a drop-off. But the point is, when fish move on structure, they pause and eventually stop at one of these breaks or break lines. Now, how far they go and how long they stay is going to be completely dependent upon the weather and the water conditions. Now, fish have proved that they're very adaptable creatures. This is how they've been able to survive over the years, and they can adapt to these changes in weather and water. But the real kicker here is they can't adapt quickly. Now, most of the changes in temperature, oxygen, air pressure, water pressure, light, pH, anything you want to say, takes place in the first 8 to 10 feet of all water. And then the deeper you go, the more stable all conditions become. So when these conditions begin to change or become unstable, rather than fight it, the fish simply drop deeper until a stable condition is reached. Now, seeing that the conditions of weather and water are changing not only day to day, but hour to hour, sometimes even minute to minute, it should be obvious that the fish will be constantly changing their position and or depth and spend most of their time in the deeper water. Now, along with this, you also must understand that fish are cold-blooded creatures, and their metabolism or speed is determined by the temperature of their environment. In the warmer waters, the fish become quite fast. The metabolism increases and it becomes quite fast. And then conversely, in the colder water, the fish become more dormant and the metabolism slows. So when you stop to consider that the temperature of the water changes drastically from the shallows to the deep, and then you consider along with that the fish are changing their position or depth, then it should be obvious that their speed is changing on a regular basis, their speed or their level of dormancy. Now, once all these facts are learned and understood, we can then develop the hand rules or the guidelines necessary for catching bass. And the overall guideline should go something like this. No matter where we fish in this country or any other country, you will use structure as your guide as to where the bass are going to be. And then we pinpoint the fish by fishing the breaks and the break lines on or connected to that structure, making sure that we're checking all depths and all speeds. Now, if you were to break successful bass fishing down to its simplest form, we could define it in two terms. First, we have to locate fish. We've got to be able to find them. And then secondly, once we find them, we have to mechanically be able to catch them. Now, catching fish is a mechanical process, and it doesn't take any real talent to learn. Anybody can do it. In fact, most of the fishermen I run to don't really have much trouble learning how to throw a cast, make a cast, or how to make a trolling pass. However, most of the fishermen, though, do have problems when it comes to locating fish. So in today's tape, I want to start off by trying to help you learn how to identify and recognize the spots or the different types of structures in your lake where the fish will be. Now, when it comes to any discussion on structure, we first have to understand that there's two types, man-made and then, of course, natural. The natural structures would include bars, humps, saddles, delta conditions, the break lines to the deeper water, holes and or slots. And then, of course, we have the man-made structure, which would, in this category, we have the dams, causeways, underwater roadbeds, underwater railroad grades, levees, wing dams, and things of this nature. And in order to give you a better idea of just exactly what structure looks like, I drove to north central Mississippi to a particular reservoir that is pulled down in the late fall about 1/3 of its normal summer stage. And when this occurs, most of the structure that we would normally be fishing is now, of course, completely out of water. And I felt that by filming these, quote, out-of-water structures, it might give you a better idea of just how to recognize and identify these features in your lake. Just so you couldn't say I wasn't earning my money, I decided to jump out here in the mud and jump on this structure here that normally, of course, is underwater. But it's such a prime example of an underwater hump, I wanted to be able to walk it a little bit and show it to you. As you can see up here on top, the crown of the hump under normal pool would probably be somewhere around 5 or 6 feet. And then it breaks off very sharply, and right where I'm standing, we've got another break line going off. Down below we have another one, and then we have the final break line into the channel. So here we have a structure that has 4 distinct break lines. Now, the problem with most bass fishermen is when they come in and find an underwater hump such as this, they'll throw some baits all across the top of it and work around maybe just around that top edge. And if they don't catch any fish, then they take off somewhere else. Now, the point is that this thing is crowning it about 5 or 6 feet. So as you understand basic movements of fish, you should know that the weather and water conditions will not allow the school of big bass to get to that shallow very often. Most of the time, the fish are going to be somewhat deeper, somewhere around this hump, but at a deeper depth. Now, as you can probably see on the camera, we've got stumps, we've got break lines, we have a whole lot of features on this thing that the knowledgeable or informed fisherman should be working. Because most of the time the fish are going to be deeper. They're not going to be up top. Now certainly when we come to fish a hump like this, we're going to check the top. But our fishing is not going to stop there. We're going to check it just to eliminate it and make sure the big fish aren't there. And then we're going to start working deeper. Now the keys to working deeper is to fish the breaks and the break lines on or connected to this structure. And in this case, as I stated, we have 4 distinct break lines. Now, exactly where deeper are you normally going to find a fish? Well, on most humps, at one side or the other, you're going to have a ridge-like or a bar-like protrusion that will end up being a contact point. You always find it. It's always there. And in this case, as you come along this break line right here, I'll maybe take a little shuffle on down here. And you swing, if I get my cameraman to swing the camera down here, you'll see on the east corner of this particular hump, we have a nice ridge-like bar. Let me just keep right on going here. I'll act just like the fish. Here we have the next break line right here, Then we have the final break line into the channel. Now in 90% of our fishing, we're going to catch our bass on this hump right there. Right there. We may catch them right here along this break line. We may catch them at the next break line, and occasionally we may catch one up top. But you have to understand, when you're fishing an underwater hump, we have to find these deeper bar-like features if we want to run into the school of fish on a consistent basis. Well, here I am again, standing out here on the mud. But again, this was such a great structure to show what I'm talking about. I wanted to get out here and walk it for you. Again, our fish will be making contact out at the end of the bar. But you remember in our early discussions I said that it's the break lines that are occurring that form the bar. If we had no break lines, it would just be flat and we wouldn't have any structure there at all. So the break lines are very important, and we also said that when fish begin to move, they hit the end of the bar and they move along structure, at times they're going to need additional help. And the help will come in the form of breaks and break lines. Well, this particular structure has some beautiful break lines that should give you the picture of exactly what we're talking about when we're talking a break line. Here we have one right up here to my left that's breaking about 2 feet. And then we have another little one right here that's breaking just about 6 inches. In most cases, fishermen will miss these smaller break lines. But to a fish, that looks like a mountain. He has no trouble following it along. And of course, right here off to my right, we have a beautiful break line that's dropping off about 3 feet. And as I said before, a break line is line on structure that runs for a distance where we have an increase in depth. And this is a pure example of what one looks like right here. Actually, we have multiple break lines on this structure. It's a beautiful structure. But again, it's quite big, it's quite large, and very wide. And for the fish to hit it and move along it, they have to have these additional features. And this break line is so definite, I mean, the fish would have absolutely no problem moving along these break lines. So I hope you get the idea of what a break line is and how fish use them. They see it as a change in light, and when they move out of the deeper water and actually hit the break line, they will follow right along the break line because that's what they're identifying with. So in our fishing, we have to have our lures right on those spots. That's the idea. Remember I said structure is our guide as to where the fish will be. But in the end, when we're actually fishing, you and I are going to meet up with the fish somewhere on a break or a break line that's either on or connected to, in some way, the main structure. Okay, before we leave this structure, I wanted to take an opportunity to point something else out, very, very important, and this is a good example of it. When we talk about the importance of break lines, actually we talk about first the importance of structure, but it's the break lines that actually form the structure. If we didn't have break lines existing, it would just be a flat and we wouldn't have any fish. So all bars to one degree or another will have some form of break line. And the problem comes in where these break lines run for quite a distance, and even though they're very recognizable to the fish because they see it as a change in light, it all looks the same to them. So in many cases, the fish are going to have something else to make them able to identify a certain spot to either contact or stop as they move along. Eventually they're going to pause and stop at some form of break. So we're always talking in terms of breaks on break lines, and here is a prime example. We have a beautiful little break line breaking off about 5 feet. I guess under normal pool this break line would be current at about 20 or 25 feet. It's breaking off a distance of about 5 feet, and it's breaking very, very sharply. So the fish should follow along, and when they reach a spot like this, here is where they will pause and eventually stop. And this is what we refer to as a break on the break line. Of course, it's just a stump. Now, I could take that stump and stick it out here in the middle of a flat, and it's just a stump. And it's of little or no importance to us whatsoever. But if I take that stump and place it on a break line, now it's a very important spot that you and I need to fish. As we continue along this break line, go down here just a little ways, just like the fish would. You can see here we have another log and stump. sitting right on the brake line. So these are very important features, and in most cases, of course, you and I can't see these features. They're not visible to the naked eye. Sometimes we won't see them on our depth sounders either, but if we're fishing properly, we're fishing the brake lines because we need to be, our lure is going to end up finding the important breaks for us. Basically what's going to happen is we're going to get hung up. But most of the time, right before you get hung up or after you get it loose, you catch a fish. So keep in mind, brakes on brake lines, very important, very critical, and this is a very good example of just what they look like. And here we have a nice, beautiful shoreline-related bar that breaks right into the river channel that has a very pronounced finger, and we're able to see it. As you follow along the brake line, you will find at one point where that brake line makes a sudden turn out and creates a secondary bar-like feature. And these are the things that we refer to as fingers. And as the fish move, they will pause and eventually stop at these features. In the case of this finger, we also have a nice big stump sitting there, which will help the fish even that much more. But these fingers are very important in our fishing, and we need to include them in our thorough presentations of any structure. Here's another good example of an underwater roadbed. We've come to the upper end of the reservoir here, and as you can see, it's really pulled down. And all that remains out there is that little side feeder stream cut. But these are the key areas, as you can see out by the cut, where that roadbed drops on off into the river. This would be the contact point. And where these roadbeds are connected with the main river channel or a side feeder stream cut, they're extremely important. Here we have a little different structure situation. It's an above water island, as you can see by the water line up there. And many breaks and brake lines exist, as you can see, but in most cases an island will have a bar or a ridge-like feature off one side or the other. And this is where the fish will make contact.